Welcome back to another slow and slightly confusing chapter of history. Tonight, we're drifting into a world where your morning coffee would literally freeze solid before you could take a sip, where stepping outside without the right gear means death in minutes, and where the most experienced explorers still wake up screaming from nightmares about what they've seen. You're about to discover why the first Arctic expeditions were essentially elaborate suicide missions disguised as scientific discovery, and why you, with all your modern conveniences and survival knowledge gleaned from YouTube videos, probably wouldn't last 3 days in the same conditions that claimed hundreds of the world's most prepared explorers. Picture this: you're standing on a ship's deck in 1845, watching the English coast disappear behind you as you sail toward the Northwest Passage. The gentleman beside you is adjusting his brass buttons and checking his pocket watch, completely confident that British ingenuity and a well-stocked library will see him through whatever frozen wasteland awaits. What he doesn't know, what none of them knew, is that they're sailing toward one of history's most notorious disasters, where 129 men would vanish so completely that we're still finding their bodies today, nearly 180 years later. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Feel free to drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. I love seeing how this story travels around the world while you're settling in for the night. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You have to understand something about these early Arctic expeditions that makes them fundamentally different from modern exploration. They weren't just about reaching a destination. They were elaborate Victorian gentlemen's clubs transported to the most hostile environment on Earth. Sir John Franklin's doomed expedition carried a library of 1,200 books, fine china dinner sets, sterling silver cutlery, and a hand organ for entertainment. They brought mahogany writing desks and personal valets. One ship even carried a piano. Imagine trying to tune a piano when it's minus 40 degrees outside and your fingers are too numb to feel the keys. This wasn't stupidity, it was a completely different philosophy of exploration. These men genuinely believed that maintaining civilized standards would somehow protect them from the Arctic's brutality. They dressed for dinner every night, even when trapped in ice. They held formal church services on Sundays, while scurvy rotted their gums. This adherence to Victorian propriety, in the face of nature's indifference, would prove to be their downfall, but it also reveals something fascinating about the human psyche. When faced with the incomprehensible, we cling to familiar rituals. The Franklin expedition represents the twilight of what historians call the heroic age of polar exploration, roughly from the 1870s to 1922, when explorers like Ernest Shackleton and Robert Falcon Scott became household names. But here's what your history textbooks probably didn't tell you: these expeditions were basically funded suicide missions. The British Admiralty knew the risks were astronomical, but the potential rewards: discovering the Northwest Passage, claiming new territories, advancing scientific knowledge, seemed worth the human cost. What makes this period even more remarkable is how these expeditions were organized like military campaigns, but with a distinctly amateur spirit. Many expedition members were drawn from Britain's upper classes, men who saw Arctic exploration as the ultimate gentleman's adventure. They brought their personal servants, their favorite books, their hunting rifles, and an unshakable belief that British superiority would somehow overcome the laws of physics and biology. The tragedy is that underneath all this Victorian pageantry, some of these men were incredibly brave and scientifically minded. They made detailed observations of weather patterns, animal behavior, and magnetic phenomena, even as they slowly starved to death. They maintained detailed journals right up until their final days, leaving behind haunting records of their gradual realization that all their preparation, all their confidence, all their civilized rituals meant nothing to the Arctic ice. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of these early expeditions is how completely unprepared they were for the psychological warfare that the Arctic wages on the human mind. They expected physical challenges, cold hunger, dangerous animals. What they didn't expect was how the endless white landscape would drive them insane, how the months of darkness would shatter their sense of time and reality, how the complete isolation would make them hallucinate voices and phantom companions. Your body is about to betray you in ways you never imagined possible. Standing in minus 40 degrees, you feel something that modern polar explorer Mark Wood describes as claustrophobic, not because you're in a small space, but because the cold creates an invisible prison around your entire body. You can't escape it, can't reason with it, can't negotiate a temporary reprieve. The Arctic doesn't care about your college degree, your gym membership, or that time you survived a really cold winter. It simply begins dismantling you cell by cell. The first thing that hits you is Arctic shock, a phenomenon that would have confused and terrified those Victorian explorers who expected to gradually acclimatize to the cold. Your body essentially goes into panic mode, flooding your system with stress hormones while simultaneously trying to preserve your core temperature by shutting down blood flow to your extremities. Within minutes, you're experiencing something that feels like claustrophobia, mixed with hypothermia, mixed with the worst anxiety attack of your life. Your heart pounds, your breathing becomes shallow, and your brain starts making increasingly poor decisions because it's literally too cold to function properly. Here's where things get medieval. You need to eat to survive, but eating in these conditions becomes a survival technique rather than a pleasure. Food becomes fuel for your internal furnace, and you learn to consume anything that provides calories regardless of taste or texture. Mark Wood once had to choke down rancid whale blubber that tasted like chewing on a car tire, but he ate it because the alternative was freezing to death. Those early explorers often carried pemmican, a mixture of dried meat fat and berries that had the consistency of leather and about as much flavor, but it kept them alive when nothing else would. But even eating becomes a challenge when your body starts cannibalizing itself. During his 50-day solo journey to the South Pole, Wood discovered that the constant friction from his ill-fitting boots had literally removed the skin from the bottom of his foot. The rawness was excruciating, but here's the truly disturbing part. He seriously considered eating the skin, because protein is protein, and nothing goes to waste when you're burning 6,000 calories a day just to stay alive. Fortunately, Antarctica's dry desert conditions allowed the wound to heal naturally, but that moment of consideration reveals how quickly civilized thinking disappears when survival is at stake. Your clothing becomes both your salvation and your potential death trap. Those early explorers wore wool and cotton materials that become deadly when wet. Modern expedition gear involves multiple thin layers that trap air and wick moisture away from your skin because if you sweat and then stop moving, that moisture will freeze against your body and give you hypothermia. Historians still argue whether some of Franklin's men died from hypothermia caused by their own sweat or from lead poisoning from their canned food supplies. The silence will drive you insane. Not the peaceful quiet of a library or a meditation retreat, but the oppressive, crushing silence of a world where nothing moves, nothing grows, nothing makes a sound except the wind and your own labored breathing. Mark Wood lost his iPod 5 days into his Antarctic journey and spent the next 45 days with nothing but his own thoughts for company. He describes reaching a point where he pitched his tent in the middle of the day and seriously considered giving up, not because of physical exhaustion, but because the mental isolation was unbearable. Your tent becomes your entire universe, but it offers no real protection from the cold. Inside, the temperature is exactly the same as outside, sometimes minus 35 degrees colder than your home freezer. The tent only protects you from wind, which is something, but you're essentially sleeping in a fabric box in subarctic conditions. The sound of lighting your stove becomes a Pavlovian trigger for happiness because it's the only source of warmth in a world that's actively trying to kill you. Sleep becomes a complex survival calculation. Your sleeping bag is rated for extreme cold, but it doesn't warm you, you warm it. This means you need to generate body heat before getting in, often by doing jumping jacks or running in place until you're actually hot, then quickly zipping yourself into the bag to trap that heat. Get this wrong, and you'll spend the night shivering uncontrollably, which burns calories you can't afford to lose and prevents the restorative sleep you desperately need. Movement keeps you alive, but movement also burns precious energy. You're caught in a constant balancing act between staying warm and conserving calories. Stop moving and frostbite begins attacking your fingers and toes within minutes. Keep moving and you exhaust your food supplies faster. Those early explorers often faced impossible choices, push forward, and risk running out of food or conserve energy and risk freezing to death. The psychological toll compounds everything else. You start making poor decisions because your brain is literally too cold to function optimally. You might forget to zip your jacket, completely leave equipment behind, or take dangerous shortcuts because the cold impairs your judgment just enough to be lethal. The early explorers' journals are filled with increasingly erratic entries as the expedition progresses, documenting not just physical deterioration, but mental collapse. You smell death approaching before you see it. Mark Wood describes that moment when he could actually smell the polar bear that had been stalking him for 3 days, a musky, predatory scent that triggered every primal survival instinct in his body. You're standing on unstable ice, 300 meters from the most efficient killing machine in the Arctic, and your heart starts beating so hard you can hear it over the wind. This isn't the theoretical danger that those Victorian explorers read about in their leather-bound journals. This is 800 pounds of muscle and claws that views you as a convenient snack. The bear jumps up onto your ice platform and sniffs your GoPro camera. You're now an arm's length away from jaws that can crush a seal's skull like you'd crack a walnut. Wood found himself staring directly into those jaws, measuring the incredible strength that could rip an animal open while being close enough to hear the bear's breathing and grunting for what felt like hours but was probably only seconds. You're locked in a staring contest with an apex predator that has no fear of humans because it's never learned to be afraid. The moment passes only because you have a flare gun and you're lucky enough that it actually works in the extreme cold and scares the bear away rather than just making it angry. But for the next 3 nights, you're sticking your head out of your tent like a meerkat, scanning for any sign that death on 4 legs might be returning. Sleep becomes impossible because every sound could be your last warning. Here's something that might blow your mind. There are actually 5 different North Poles, and understanding this could save your life when traditional navigation fails. The geographic North Pole is what most people think of the fixed point at the top of the planet where all lines of longitude converge. But there's also the pole of inaccessibility, which sits in the Arctic Ocean, equidistant from any landmass. Then you have the moving poles, the geomagnetic North Pole, currently crossing Canadian Ellesmere Island, and the magnetic North Pole, which is drifting from Canada toward Russia so rapidly that it's constantly in the news. Finally, there's the celestial North Pole, the point in the sky directly above the geographic North Pole. Historians still argue whether some of the lost expeditions might have been trying to reach different poles, leading to confusion about their actual destinations. The animal life in this frozen wasteland ranges from magnificent to bizarrely adorable. You might encounter Arctic foxes with their impossibly thick winter coats, Arctic hares that have evolved to be nearly invisible against the snow, or massive musk oxen that look like prehistoric creatures wrapped in fur blankets. The reindeer or caribou, depending on your location, travel in herds that can stretch for miles across the tundra. But perhaps the most surprising Arctic resident is the tiny lemming, a rodent so small and cute that Mark Wood admits he'd want one as a pet, though he jokes about having to hide it from people who think a 58-year-old man shouldn't have a teddy bear. Bird life is almost non-existent, except for the remarkable Arctic tern, which holds the record for the longest migration on Earth. These birds literally fly from Arctic to Antarctic and back again each year, experiencing 2 summers and seeing more daylight than any other creature on the planet. Sometimes they're the only sign of life you'll see for weeks. The most unsettling encounter might be with a lemming that simply walks into your tent uninvited, as happened to Wood during one expedition. This tiny rodent just strolled in like it was his home, posed for some photographs, then wandered back out into the frozen wasteland. You're left wondering how this small creature survives in conditions that would kill you in hours, and there's something both humbling and terrifying about sharing your temporary shelter with an animal that's so perfectly adapted to this hostile environment that it treats minus 40 degrees as just another day at the office. The predator-prey relationships here operate on a completely different scale than anything you're familiar with. In the Canadian High Arctic, an area roughly half the size of Europe, there are only about 500 humans spread across a few settlements, like Grise Fjord and Resolute Bay. But the polar bear population in this same area significantly outnumbers the humans. You're not at the top of the food chain anymore. You're not even close to the top. You're a slow, awkward, poorly adapted intruder in an ecosystem where everything else is perfectly designed to either kill or survive. The bears aren't just randomly dangerous, they're intelligent hunters. They can track you for days, learning your patterns and waiting for the perfect moment to strike. They're also curious, which can be even more dangerous than aggression because a curious polar bear might approach just to investigate, bringing those crushing jaws within striking distance before deciding whether you're food threat or just something interesting to sniff. Your flare gun becomes your lifeline, but it's a one-shot solution to a multi-day problem. Once you've scared off a bear, you've also announced your presence to every other predator in the area. And if the flare doesn't work, if it's too cold, too wet, or if you miss, you're standing on unstable ice with nothing between you and certain death except your ability to look intimidating to an animal that fears nothing. Your iPhone is now a useless rectangle of glass and metal. The extreme cold has drained its battery in minutes, and even if it somehow still worked, there are no cell towers for thousands of miles in any direction. This is where you truly appreciate the massive technological gap between those Victorian explorers and modern Arctic expeditions. While Sir John Franklin's crew brought mahogany desks and formal dinner sets, today's explorers carry satellite phones that can connect directly with rescue services, but only if you remember that emotional phone calls home can literally kill you. Mark Wood refuses to call friends and family during extreme expeditions, not because the technology doesn't work, but because hearing familiar voices would drain the buildup of non-emotion that keeps him focused on survival. One conversation with someone you love can weaken that psychological armor you've built against the Arctic's brutal indifference, and that moment of emotional vulnerability might be the difference between reaching your destination and giving up when things get truly desperate. The navigation challenges would have been mind-bending for those early explorers. Magnetic compasses become unreliable as you approach the magnetic poles, sometimes spinning wildly or pointing in completely wrong directions. The early expeditions relied on celestial navigation, but imagine trying to take accurate readings of stars and sun when your hands are too numb to hold instruments steady, when your breath instantly fogs any optical equipment, and when the horizon disappears in endless white. GPS has revolutionized modern polar exploration, but even satellite signals can be disrupted by solar activity and extreme weather conditions. Food technology represents perhaps the most dramatic improvement between eras. Those Victorian explorers carried tinned foods that we now know were often contaminated with lead from the soldering process. The very supplies meant to keep them alive were slowly poisoning them. They also brought hardtack biscuits that could crack teeth-salted pork that turned rancid, and that infamous pemmican that had the texture of leather and roughly the same nutritional appeal. Historians still argue whether lead poisoning from canned goods contributed more to Franklin's expedition disaster than starvation or scurvy. Modern expedition food seems almost luxurious by comparison. Mark Wood carries a small packets of freeze-dried meals that expand when you add boiling water, curries, stews, pastas, even apple custard for dessert. Everything is calculated for maximum calories and nutrition in minimum weight and volume. Instead of carrying pounds of provisions per day, he can survive on 2 handfuls of food that pack the energy equivalent of multiple Victorian meals. The variety also provides crucial psychological benefits. Eating the same leather like pemmican for months would drive anyone insane. Your cooking equipment becomes the difference between life and death. Modern expeditioners carry highly reliable, lightweight stoves designed to function in extreme cold, but they're still mechanical devices that can fail when you need them most. The sound of your stove lighting becomes a Pavlovian trigger for happiness, not just because it means hot food, but because it represents the only source of heat in your frozen world. Those early explorers often carried elaborate cooking setups that were heavy, inefficient, and prone to failure, but they also brought backup systems like oil lamps and even small amounts of alcohol for emergency warming. The shelter technology gap is equally dramatic. Modern tents are engineered marvels designed to withstand hurricane force winds while remaining lightweight enough for one person to carry. They use advanced materials that don't become brittle in extreme cold and feature ventilation systems that prevent condensation from freezing inside. Compare this to the canvas tents and improvised shelters that early explorers used, often weighted down with whatever heavy objects they could find and offering minimal protection from the elements. Communication represents the most life-saving technological advance. Modern explorers carry emergency beacons that can summon rescue from anywhere on Earth with the press of a button. This single device fundamentally changes the psychology of polar exploration. You're never truly alone because help is always one signal away. Those early expeditions disappeared completely, sometimes for years, with no way to call for help or even let the outside world know they were in trouble. But here's the fascinating paradox. Despite all these technological advantages, modern explorers often face psychological challenges that their Victorian predecessors might not have experienced. Those early explorers expected to be completely cut off from civilization. It was part of the adventure. Modern explorers accustomed to constant connectivity often struggle more with the isolation because they know communication is technically possible but choose not to use it for psychological reasons. The weight considerations alone would astound those early expeditions. Mark Wood can carry everything he needs for weeks of solo exploration in a pack that weighs less than a single Victorian expedition member's formal dinner outfit. Modern materials, science has created equipment that would seem like magic to Franklin's crew, sleeping bags that work in minus 40 degrees, but weigh only a few pounds, clothing that breathes and insulates, simultaneously tools that fold into impossibly small packages, but perform multiple functions. Your mind breaks long before your body gives out. 36 hours into Mark Wood's Antarctic journey, he found himself sitting in his tent in the middle of the day crying and seriously considering abandoning an expedition he'd spent 3 years planning. This wasn't physical exhaustion or equipment failure. This was the moment when the human psyche encounters something it simply wasn't designed to handle: absolute isolation in an environment that offers no comfort, no familiar reference points, no hope of rescue, except what you carry within yourself. The trigger was losing his iPod, a small white device that disappeared into the white landscape like it was designed to vanish. Suddenly, Wood faced 50 days with nothing but his own thoughts for company surrounded by a 360-degree view of absolutely nothing. No trees, no buildings, no signs of life, just endless white in every direction, stretching to horizons that seemed impossibly far away. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was oppressive, crushing, like being trapped inside your own skull with no escape from the endless loop of your own mental noise. This is where you encounter one of the most mysterious phenomena in extreme exploration, the third man factor. As Wood pushed himself up a 3,000-meter plateau toward the South Pole fighting against brutal headwinds, while his body began to fail, he felt an arm slip around his shoulder. He was completely alone, but someone was gripping his shoulder, leaning into him, whispering words of encouragement. Keep going, keep going, keep going. The presence felt so real that it allowed him to enter an almost zen-like state, his mind clearing even as his body struggled against the elements. This wasn't a one-time hallucination. The phantom companion appeared 6 or 7 times during that expedition, always when Wood was at his lowest point, never when he consciously called for help. When he returned to Canada and sheepishly shared this experience with another explorer, he learned that it's a well-documented phenomenon. His friend had experienced something similar during a desperate search for cached food supplies near the North Pole, an inner voice telling him to search to the left, leading him to discover the buried supplies that saved their lives. Scientists would probably explain this as the brain manufacturing support when you're at your lowest ebb, creating the psychological assistance you need to survive. But Wood wonders if it might have been the spirit of his mother who had died 10 years earlier. Historians still argue whether these experiences represent hallucinations born of extreme stress or something more mysterious, a survival mechanism that evolution built into the human psyche for our most desperate moments. The psychological preparation for these expeditions involves deliberately building walls around your emotions. You have to construct a version of yourself that's capable of enduring weeks of monotony, discomfort, and genuine danger without breaking down. But this emotional armor comes with a price. You become disconnected from the parts of yourself that make life meaningful. Wood describes it as building up non-emotion, a psychological state that allows you to function in conditions that would normally trigger panic despair or overwhelming homesickness. Those early Victorian explorers faced these same psychological challenges, but with even fewer coping mechanisms. They maintained elaborate social rituals, formal dinners, religious services, scientific observations, partly to keep their minds occupied and partly to preserve some connection to civilization. But their journals reveal the gradual breakdown of these social structures as expeditions progressed and men began to crack under the psychological pressure. The decision to give up becomes a constant temptation that you have to resist multiple times every day. It's not one dramatic moment of defeat. It's 1,000 small moments when continuing forward seems impossible and turning back seems reasonable. Wood spent 36 hours in his tent, wrestling with this decision, going through all the logical reasons why quitting made sense. He was alone, under-equipped, facing impossible conditions, and no one would blame him for giving up. What saved him was a phone call to a friend back in the UK, not for rescue, but for perspective. His friend talked him through the crisis without making the decision, for him providing just enough emotional support to get Wood back on his feet. But the friend didn't make him move forward. That decision had to come from within. Wood describes the recovery as simply putting one foot in front of the other for 1,000 feet, then repeating that process until he reached the South Pole. The loneliness is unlike anything you've experienced in normal life. It's not the temporary solitude of being alone in your house, or even the isolation of being in a crowd where no one knows you. This is existential aloneness, the knowledge that if something goes wrong, no one will find your body for months or years. You become acutely aware of your own mortality while simultaneously having to suppress that awareness to function. Memory becomes both friend and enemy. Positive memories can provide comfort during the worst moments, but they can also trigger overwhelming homesickness that saps your will to continue. Wood learned to carefully ration his emotional memories, saving thoughts of home for specific moments when he needed psychological fuel, but avoiding them when they might weaken his resolve. The mind creates its own entertainment in the absence of external stimulation. You find yourself having detailed conversations with imaginary companions, replaying movie scenes in perfect detail, or becoming fascinated by the smallest variations in snow texture. These mental games are survival mechanisms, but they also reveal how desperately the human brain needs stimulation to remain stable. You're witnessing the planet's memory being exposed in real time. As the Arctic ice melts at unprecedented rates, it's revealing secrets that have been frozen for centuries, including the cannibalized remains of Franklin's expedition members scattered across the Canadian Arctic like breadcrumbs from a nightmare that played out 180 years ago. The ice that once preserved these men and their stories is disappearing so quickly that archaeologists are racing against time to document what emerges before it's lost forever to decomposition and scavengers. Mark Wood carries ice samples from both poles, clear, ancient ice that looks identical to your eyes, but tells vastly different stories. The Antarctic ice sits on top of a landmass pure frozen water that has accumulated over millions of years in one of the most pristine environments on Earth. The Arctic ice floats on ocean water containing salt and minerals that change its fundamental properties. These two types of ice represent completely different climate systems, and both are disappearing faster than scientists predicted even a decade ago. Here's something that might reshape how you think about melting ice. The massive ice sheets have their own gravitational pull. The Arctic ice cap is so enormous that it literally draws water from oceans around the planet toward the North Pole, where it freezes and adds to the ice mass. This creates a self-reinforcing system where more ice attracts more water, which becomes more ice. But climate change has broken this ancient cycle. As the ice melts, it loses its gravitational influence and releases all that captured water back to the world's oceans, contributing to rising sea levels in ways that simple ice cube in a glass analogies can't explain. The human stories emerging from the melting ice are becoming increasingly disturbing. Franklin's expedition wasn't just a tale of heroic failure, it was a descent into something approaching hell on Earth. The recently discovered remains show clear evidence of cannibalism knife marks on bones where desperate men carved meat from their dead companions. Historians still argue whether this happened early in the expedition when men were already starving, or later when madness and desperation had completely broken down the Victorian social order these men had tried so desperately to maintain. These revelations fundamentally change our understanding of what those early explorers endured. The journals and official records spoke of maintaining British dignity and scientific purpose right until the end, but the physical evidence tells a different story. When you're reduced to eating your expedition mates to survive another day, all the mahogany writing desks and formal dinner services in the world become meaningless props in a survival horror story that would challenge the sanest person's grip on reality. The speed of change in the Arctic is staggering. Areas that have been frozen solid for thousands of years are now experiencing summer melts that expose land artifacts and organic matter that hasn't seen sunlight since before recorded history. This isn't gradual change measured in geological time. This is transformation happening fast enough for individual researchers to document dramatic differences from one field season to the next. Modern polar explorers like Wood are witnessing the end of an era. The routes he's traveled, the ice formations, he's navigated the wildlife populations, he's encountered many of these, will be significantly different or completely gone within his lifetime. He's essentially documenting a vanishing world, creating records of ice conditions and wildlife behavior that future generations will study to understand what the Arctic was like before it fundamentally changed. The psychological impact on indigenous Arctic communities adds another layer of tragedy to this environmental transformation. These are people whose entire cultural identity, traditional knowledge, and subsistence lifestyle are built around ice conditions that have remained stable for millennia. Hunting routes that have been used for generations are becoming impassable. Traditional knowledge about ice safety and weather patterns is becoming unreliable as the fundamental rules of Arctic existence change faster than cultural adaptation can keep pace. But perhaps the most haunting aspect of this transformation is how it's revealing the full scope of human ambition and failure in the polar regions. Every expedition that went wrong, every cache of supplies that was never recovered, every grave marker that was lost, the melting ice is exposing all of it. We're getting a comprehensive archaeological record of polar exploration's darkest chapters, preserved in perfect detail by the same ice that's now disappearing forever. The irony is almost poetic. The same climate change that's caused by human industrial activity is now exposing the remains of humans who died trying to conquer these frozen regions before we had the technology to survive there safely. The ice that killed Franklin's men is melting because of activities that began shortly after their deaths, creating a direct line between Victorian-era ambition and 21st century consequences. You're living through a moment when the Earth's polar regions are transitioning from stable, predictable systems that have existed since before human civilization to something completely unknown. The ice that has shaped ocean currents, weather patterns, and wildlife populations for millions of years is disappearing within a single human generation. Those early explorers died trying to map and understand a polar world that we're now watching vanish in real time. The final unsettling truth is that we're all polar explorers now, whether we realize it or not. The same forces that are melting the Arctic ice are changing climate patterns everywhere on Earth. The courage, resourcefulness, and psychological resilience that those early explorers needed to survive in extreme conditions we're going to need those same qualities to navigate the world we're creating through our own success as a species. The ancient ice continues melting, carrying away stories we'll never fully recover and changing our planet in ways we're only beginning to understand. The silence that once drove explorers to the edge of madness is being replaced by the constant sound of shifting, melting, transforming ice, a reminder that even the most permanent seeming features of our world are more fragile than we ever imagined. As you drift off to sleep tonight, perhaps you can hear that silence between the sounds of your own world, the quiet that exists between your heartbeats, between the hum of electricity and the distant murmur of traffic. It's a gentler silence than what those explorers faced, a silence filled with the promise of morning rather than the threat of endless white. Let that peaceful quiet carry you toward dreams of warmer places, softer landings, and the comfort of knowing that your greatest adventure tomorrow will probably involve nothing more dangerous than finding matching socks. The ice keeps melting, the stories keep emerging, and somewhere in the vast white spaces of our planet, the wind continues to blow across landscapes that fewer and fewer humans will ever experience directly. But tonight, you're safe and warm, and that's its own kind of miracle worth appreciating as you settle into whatever dreams the darkness brings. Sweet dreams, knowing that the most extreme expedition you'll face tonight is the journey from wakefulness into sleep and back again to another day in a world that's constantly changing, but still for now manageable enough to call home.